Okay, I think we'll go ahead and get started today. Welcome everyone, my name is Sharon Reed and I'm the Programs and Events Coordinator for the Hood Museum of Art. And today we're pleased to bring you Shooting Stars Hollywood Photography from the John Kobal Foundation collection. We have launched a poll and ask that you please respond as you can. We'll include tips and housekeeping information into the chat box for your convenience. But again, if you have questions, just let us know in the chat box and we'll get back to you. If you have questions about the program throughout and don't want to forget them before the Q&A at the end, please feel free to enter them at any time throughout the program into the Q&A box. We'll monitor that and we will ask your question as time allows near the end. And now I'm happy to introduce you to our Virginia Rice Kelsey 1961S director, John Stomberg.
Hello, everybody, and welcome. It's great to have you here on this beautiful afternoon. We at the Hood are very excited to start this program. It's the beginning of what we hope will be a long and interesting project working with the Kobal Foundation print archive, which the Hood Museum now owns. As is our way, before we get started, we'd like to acknowledge that the Hood Museum of Art at Dartmouth is situated on the ancestral and unceded lands of the Abenaki people. This acknowledgement reminds us of the significance of place, the continued existence of Indigenous people, and the museum and Dartmouth's commitment to building respectful relationships with those who call these lands home today. And in fact, Indigenous studies and Native American studies are some of the areas that will be using this fantastic collection of Hollywood photographs, which has come to the Hood. It includes more than 6,000 prints, many of them vintage, many of them lifetime, by photographers such as George Harrell, Clarence Sinclair Bull, Ted Allen, Ruth Harriet Louise, and many, many others. And it has all the stars you can imagine. We have images of a very young Lillian Gish, all the way up to Barbara Streisand. This will really change the way Dartmouth teaches with and learns about Hollywood and American culture in a profound way. So it is in that context, within the context of the Hood receiving this amazing archive, that we bring to you today's program. And I now turn it over to our Curator Emeritus, who shepherded all of this into being for us, Katherine Hart.
Thank you, John. Good afternoon. It is my pleasure to introduce our three guests in the order they will speak. Simon Crocker has had a long and wide-ranging involvement in fine art, music, commercial, as well as archival photography. From 1974 until 1999, he was the managing director and subsequently chairman of the Kobal collection. With John Kobal, he turned it into the world's leading private archive of film photography with offices in London, New York, and Barcelona. He has been chairman of the John Kobal Foundation since the charity was formed shortly before John's death in 1991. Robert Dance is a 1977 graduate of Dartmouth College. He serves on the council of the John Kobal Foundation and is considered to be a leading authority and scholar on Hollywood photography, as well as the author of numerous books on the subject. Mary Desjardins is professor of film and media studies at Dartmouth. She's the author of Recycled Stars, Female Film Stardom in the Age of Television and Video, and co-editor of Dietrich Icon. She's currently working on a book project about the relationships between print journalism and Hollywood publicity and public relations in the studio era of 1930 to 1960. So I will pause here and I will turn over the screen to Simon to begin his talk. Hold on just a second. There we go. Okay, yeah, there we go.
Am I on?
Yes, you're on.
I'm on, okay. Welcome everyone from the Cotswolds in England. I haven't got the showbiz background like Kathy has with her Hollywood Hills behind her, I'm afraid. Just the Cotswold Hills here. John Kobal, it's very difficult to cover John Kobal in 10 minutes, but I'll do my best. He was a larger-than-life character. His first picture is him in the late 80s in his apartment in New York, where he wrote many of his books. He was a very commanding figure. He was 6'2". He had an actor's voice. It was a sort of low rumble that rolled across the room and drew you to him. If he was in a crowded room, he'd be the one you'd notice. But it all started way back. He was born in the war in, here we are. He's born in the war in Linz in Austria, another good time to be born in Nazi-occupied Europe, which has been bombed by the Allies. And as the war went on, shortage of food, it must have been a pretty tough time. I mean, his father was Ruthenian, which is from the borders of Ukraine and Czechoslovakia and Poland. His mother was Austrian. His first language was obviously German. And as the war went on, and the Russians were approaching, by then, by the way, in 1944, he had a sister, Monica. I only mentioned her because she was a long-standing trustee of the foundation, sadly died a couple of months ago. But as the Russians were heading towards Austria and Linz, the family fled to Salzburg, where they lived with his grandmother. Now, one of the advantages of that was they were in the American zone of occupation. And one of the things that was there was a hut near where they lived, where the American forces showed movies. And John found out that in the blackouts on the windows, there were gaps. And the first American movie he ever saw, probably one of the first movies he ever saw projected, was Gilda with Rita Hayworth. And this photo here is by Bob Coburn, taken in 1946. And that started his lifelong love of particularly American movies. He was dislocated again when they moved to Canada in 1950. He didn't speak the language. They found it difficult. Here was the land of plenty. They'd come from a land where there hadn't been plenty at the end of the war in Europe. And he didn't have a great relationship with his father, who junked all the comic books that he'd collected. And so he basically went on and ignored his father and started collecting film magazines. And I think this is one of the things that gave him solace. And the kind of movies that he was interested in were some of the older movies. And in Canada, he would be able to see them for the first time on TV and in repertory theaters. And there are a few photos. All these photos I'm showing are now in the archive at the Hood. But he actually, in the first instance, decided he wanted to be an actor. And because he acted at school, he got good reviews in local productions. He went to New York when he was 18, didn't really work, but he decided he'd keep going. But before he did that, he happened to meet a very seminal meeting. I'm not even going to tell you this story. You can read the introduction to his book, People Will Talk. But he met Marlene Dietrich at the O'Keefe Center in Toronto, who took him under her wing that evening. And basically, she was the first big movie star he met. And he knew from then on, that's one of the things he wanted to do, was meet more movie stars and movie makers and talk to them about their lives. He came to England in 1960, still wanting to be an actor. And he spent the next 4 years in what you call stock companies, what we call repertory theaters, which are theaters in every big city in England and in the UK. And of course, he had plenty of time on his hands, so he started then collecting more seriously magazines, film annuals, any film stills he could find. And there are a lot more of those around, because cinemas were closing because of television and throwing their stills away. By 1964, he realized he wasn't going to make it as an actor, but he wanted to go back to what he originally wanted to do, was to meet movie makers and movie stars and talk to them about movies. And he was very tall, as I said, had a very commanding presence. And he had the gift of the gab. He persuaded the BBC to send him to New York to interview people for the only program the BBC then had on movies, which ironically was on radio. It's called Movie Go Round. And this gave him access to, yes, to new stars like Robert Redford and so on, but more importantly, gave him access to Hollywood greats like Joan Crawford, who were appearing in kind of subsidiary roles in Disney movies at that time. And at the same time, he started writing for magazines, newspapers, in the UK mainly, but also beginning in America as well. And his collection of photos grew because he knew that photos were great props for his interviews. I mean, he was only in his early 20s at this time, and he was meeting all these very important people, and he was quite nervous doing it. And the photos were a wonderful prop for him to take into meetings. Here are a few examples of some of the people he interviewed: Alfred Hitchcock in 1969 for Topaz, Ingrid Bergman a bit later on stage at the National Film Theatre in London. He knew Andy Warhol and Paul Morrissey well, and here's an interview they did with Gloria Swanson, which was apparently very frustrating because all she wanted to talk about was health food, and all he wanted to talk about was her movies. But anyway, so he gradually in the 60s and early 70s started building up his collection. And of course, it was a great timing, because at that time in England especially, all these magazines as part of newspapers started, and they all needed features. And the young art directors all used movies as a reference. And John was this guy who they heard had these photos, and he started not only doing interviews for them, but providing photographs. And slowly in France and Germany and Italy and America, people started hearing about what it was known as the Kobal collection, and started using extensively his archive. And these are some of the photos. Again, these are all in your now at the hood. These are just examples. All genre, wonderful movies, wonderful people. One of the things, of course, luck was, as I say, a huge ingredient. I mean, one example of luck was, and this is very typical of how it sort of went. Highsmith was a publicist at Paramount. He had a then successful comedy duo, Alan and Rossi, and he needed them interviewed for a not very good film. John said he would do it. In return, he would be allowed to look at old photos in Paramount's files. In those, he found pictures of Nancy Carroll, who he loved. A few days later, or a few weeks later, he's outside St. Patrick's Cathedral in New York, and there was Nancy Carroll coming down the steps. And he said, "Hey, you're Nancy Carroll." And that was it. And they became friends, and she introduced him to her daughter, who worked for Tallulah Bankhead's agent. And Tallulah, as John said, unlocked Hollywood for him. She rang all her friends, including people like George Cukor, and said, before John first went out to LA, and said, "Darling, I'm sending you this man who knows everything about movies, but hasn't got a penny in his pocket." And but it did. I mean, John met a lot of people who helped him a lot. Besides Tallulah, Loretta Young became a friend, Louise Brooks. In fact, with Louise, you'll find in the Hood archive papers some wonderful, she used to rip out pages from magazines and write scatological things on them and send them to us. You'll find those in the Hood archive somewhere. I guess for all these early years, obviously he was interested in the movies and stills and movie stars, but he gradually began to realize that there were individual names. He picked up the names of individual photographers, and he realized they had different styles, so he became interested in them. And he tried to track them down, and not with a great deal of luck. But then by chance, in 1969, he was sent by the Sunday Times in London to interview Mae Breckinridge for a rather terrible, Mae West for a rather terrible film called Myra Breckinridge. And on the set was this older guy with a camera around his neck taking photographs. And he asked him what he did, and he said, "I'm taking publicity stills." And he said, "What's your name?" He said, "My name's George Harrell." And he said, "But the MGM told me you were dead, So George, and Bob would be talking about the photographers, but he was obviously one of the best known of the Hollywood photographers, one of the great ones. It's a photo on the right of he took a Mae West in 1932. But the meeting with George was very seminal because through George, we met, John met, obviously other photographers in Mclaren Sinclair Bull, the head of MGM for many years. And on the photo is a picture of me with John, because I came into the picture around this time. It's horrendous looking at the picture of myself so young, actually, I can't quite remember that. But, and we produced portfolios of Garbo with Bull, and he was a lovely man, actually, and got a great oral history from him of Hollywood. And Laszlo Willinger was another one, Ted Allen. These all became people we worked with very closely. There's Ted with a picture of one of his portraits of Jean Harlow, Bob Coburn, William Walling Jr. And all these led up to John doing, eventually doing two things. He did a book, The Art of the Great Hollywood Portrait Photographers, which is the book that really, for the first time, projected these men as artists. And he started doing exhibitions to go with that. In fact, he'd already started doing it. The first one was at the V&A in London in 1974. First one in America was in LA, but the big one was the Museum of Modern Art in 1981. Here's John with, it's opened by Lana Turner. So with George Harrell on the left and Madison Lacey on the right. Madison sadly died before the MoMA exhibition, but we used one of Madison's photos for of Lana Turner for our book Hollywood Icons. And here they are. This is the seminal opening row, the Museum of Modern Art, New York. George on the left, Ted Allen in the middle, Laszlo on the right. This is at the moment, I think, when they realized that, because they were actually quite worried that John spent too much time and money on trying to sort of promote them, and they realized for the first time that maybe John was right, that they did have something going for them, and they had some lasting value. He wrote a lot of books. I mean, the key ones, Gotta Sing, Gotta Dance, about musicals, Rita Hayworth, The Time, the Place, and the Woman, which is a terrific book if you want to know about the star system and how it worked and what it was like going through it. Obviously, the photographers I've talked about. People Will Talk, which is the book I point everyone to, which is his collection of conversations with stars. They're more than interviews. And of course, The Lost World of DeMille, which was only published a year and a half ago. He also was getting into television before he died. We made a wonderful movie for MGM UA with Jane Russell's, you see here with John, with Dorothy Lamour, Tab Hunter, Mamie Van Doren. You can seek that out, it's great fun. And John is great in it. He also went back to a bit of acting. He appeared in a British Film Institute Channel 4 film as a man in hallway, a very memorable role. And of course, in time, he became the subject of photography as well himself. Here's George Harrell, took his photo in 1982, Laszlo Willinger in 1980, Abe Franlich, 1986, Helmut Newton in Monte Carlo, 1988, and of course, ultimately Andy Warhol shot his portrait in 1986. On the left, you see Andy doing a Polaroid of John, and here's the portrait on the right, which now hangs in the National Portrait Gallery in London. And I'm not going to read all this, but the only thing I will say is this is a short extract from the obituary of John Kobal. I'll just read the last two lines, which are, for those who knew him, John regularly tops their lists of the most memorable person I ever met. For those who didn't, one can best quote Sir Christopher Wren's tombstone: if you seek his monument, look around you. And here, almost the nicest tribute from Laszlo Willinger, one of the top Hollywood photographers. He gave a vintage print to John and Vivian Lee from Waterloo Road and signed it to John, who started it all. And his legacy is the John Kobal Foundation. And basically, we've been going since 1991, and we've supported contemporary photography as well as promoting the Hollywood archive that we have. We ran one of the major awards for contemporary photography in England from 1993 to 2002. We give grants and we help basically people, artists who need support in the earlier and mid stages of their career. And that's about it. That's John Kobal in probably too long a nutshell.
I think what Kathy said was, and now for Robert Dance. And you're now.
All right.
There we go.
I'm muted. I'm going to talk a little bit today about the major photographers who John collected. Tell you a little bit about them, the photographers that have the greatest number of photographic prints in the Foundation's archive. I'm starting with a photographer who is not included in the archive, Annie Leibovitz, because I thought this was a particularly interesting photograph made about 10 years ago in Calabasas, California. It shows her at work in a portable set that she's set up outside. It shows the lights, it shows a stool, there's a box, the photographer herself. Interestingly, we don't see a camera because these days cameras are much smaller than the kinds of cameras the Hollywood photographers used back the 20s and 30s and 40s. And I think significantly, Annie Leibovitz and other photographers working today work almost exclusively with digital photography, where in the times past, photographers were still using film. So here I'm showing a comparison between the Annie Leibovitz setting up her portable set and the interior of Ruth Harriet Louise's third floor studio at MGM. The subject is Norma Shearer. She's being photographed in one of her spectacular dresses for the 1926 film Upstage. So I think it's apparent that the way glamour photographs, the way portrait photographs are taken today is not that much different from the way they were taken 80 or 90 years ago. There's a certain casualness around where the main action is taken, but of course, at the center of the photograph, it's not casual at all. Now, I have just lost my control and it's moving by itself.
Bob, it's static on my screen. I don't know if it's static on the other panelist's screen.
There we go again. I'm sorry. For some reason, everything just see, now it's moving by itself.
Okay.
I don't know why.
We're still at Ruth Harriet Louise photographing Joan Crawford.
We hadn't gotten there yet.
Okay. Let me see if I, Bob, go up and ask to share your screen again.
No, it says I have shared screen, so I don't know why it's moving by itself.
Yeah, I'm not sure either.
All right, well, I'll move on. We can go forward.
Okay.
All right. Ruth Harriet Louise was the only woman who had a significant career as a photographer in the Hollywood of the early years, say from the teens, really even beyond the war era up to the 50s. She was born in 1903. This photograph was taken in 1928. She's photographing Joan Crawford. She came to MGM in 1925 when she was just 22. So she not only had tremendous talent, she had youth. I think part of the effect of her youth was that she was about the same age as her subjects. And as you see, she's very stylishly dressed, Occasionally, when she was on the lot, she was mistaken for a film star. Fans often asked her to sign autographs, which she thought was very interesting because, of course, she wasn't a performer. The image that I showed just before of Annie Leibovitz and Louise Studio was a blank background, which is very typical in the making of glamour photographs, so that the star being photographed is the subject. But sometimes Louise, and she was one of the first who would use very interesting backdrops, including this very Art Deco, I don't know whether it's a piece of fabric or painted, but it makes a very dramatic 1928 background. What's important to look at here is the camera that she's working with. These are these large 8x10 cameras, and they're called 8x10 cameras because that's the size. 8x10-inch film was put in them. So these were enormous sheets of film. The cameras worked very slowly, and they liked using the cameras with 8x10 film because they could be retouched. And of course, many of these early photographs were retouched by hand, unlike the way you can manipulate something digitally today. And also because when the photographs were enlarged, if you start with an 8x10 matrix and go up to 11x14 or something larger, you can save the resolution. Now again, Kathy, I don't have any way to move forward. It's just appeared. All right. Here are two examples of Ruth Harriet Louise's work. As I mentioned before, she was sitting with Joan Crawford in the last photograph. On the right, for a film, Our Modern Maidens, Crawford is in a very glamorous pose. This was taken on the Art Deco set, 1929. It's sort of the full experience of what we think of as the extravagance of the just before talkie era in the movies. On the left, it's a very it's a practically unique, or it is a unique series of photographs because it depicts Nina Mae McKinney and Daniel Haynes, who made a film called Hallelujah at MGM in 1929, directed by King Vidor. And it was the first, and for a long time, the only film made by a major studio with an all-black cast. Nina Mae McKinney was something of a star. Daniel Haynes had been on stage, and MGM gave them this opportunity. The film was pretty successful, but alas, these sorts of films weren't made for many years later. So Ruth Harriet Louise did all of the portrait work, including this tableau where they're acting out a dramatic scene from the film. I also, just as a PS, had the good fortune to study with King Vidor when I was at Dartmouth. He came up in 1976 to teach as a guest lecturer in class. So it's nice for me, looking back to a 1929 photograph, to have a 1976 connection right back to this photograph. Sorry, I'm having a little technical problem. The second of the great photographers that I want to talk about, Simon mentioned Clarence Sinclair Bull. He became known as the man who shot Garbo. John, along with Terence Pepper, did an amazing exhibition back in 1989 at the National Portrait Gallery. I mean, an extraordinary, huge show of a retrospective of Clarence Bull's work from the beginning to the end. Bull worked from really the late teens through the late 50s. He had the longest career, one of the most illustriouses. Of course, on the cover of The Man Who Shot Garbo is a portrait of Garbo from the film Mata Hari. At the right, at the end of, actually the end of both Clarence Bull and Grace Kelly's career. So Clarence is shown in the studio with Kelly. Her last two films were made at MGM, and it was just before she gave up the movies forever to marry Renier of Monaco. So two giants of the movies, Clarence Bull and Grace Kelly, really for the last time working. As I said, Clarence Bull, the man who shot Garbo. Here is a 1931 portrait of Garbo for a film called Inspiration. I'm pretty sure that the Foundation's archive has more Clarence Bull than anybody else. And within the Clarence Bull collection, of which is certainly over 1,000 prints, one of the strongest are vintage 11x14s of Garbo. So this is pulled pretty much at random. She never took a bad picture. And it's one example of the treasures of the collection, Clarence Bull and Greta Garbo. Next is George Hurrell. George Hurrell is standing. Again, we see the gigantic cameras that they worked with. I'm not sure who the star is he's photographing. It's a little tricky. Mary might be able to tell from this angle and could tell me. But here's another example of the process, the way the glamour factory worked. And you'll notice in the background, there's a hairdresser or maid or makeup artist looking off, not at all interested in what's going on, but waiting for her call. Hurrell's great subject was Joan Crawford. Hurrell was an interesting fellow. He revolutionized photography in a number of ways. His extreme whites and extreme blacks had never been seen in photography, certainly in Hollywood before. And one of the things he did is he asked his subjects, particularly the women, to come into a studio without wearing any makeup, that he would do the magic by himself. He would then let them put on lipstick and eye makeup, but the skin was supposed to be entirely natural. And in the photograph on the right, Crawford is not wearing any makeup. You see some lines in her face, you see her freckles, and she's as beautiful without makeup as she is on the left in what is really an iconic example of full Hollywood glamour. A photograph that has been retouched. Her skin has been made to look like marble. The blacks are very black, the whites, the shadows. And it's one of the reasons that Hurrell is probably the greatest master in Hollywood. He is the one photographer whose work is now accepted in the canon of photography as one of the Hollywood photographers whose work has been accepted into the canon of photography as alongside other giants. Ted Allen, Simon just mentioned, is another one of John's favorite photographers. Got to know him late in life. Ted printed many of his photographs in the 1970s. At the right again. Here he's using a 5x7 camera, which is interesting instead of an 8x10. That was also a standard size, perhaps because of the tricky angle and the weight. He's using a slightly smaller format than some of the bigger ones, photographing Eleanor Powell. And on the left, it's just, I'm showing it because it's one of my favorite, the Marx Brothers, Alan didn't work as much with the glamour girls as he worked with a lot of the other people on the set. Hurrell was working with the glamour girls, and Ted Allen had a particular affinity working with men. So I selected this one of the Marx Brothers. There's plenty more Ted Allen to look at in the collection. And I'll conclude with Ernest Bachrach, another one of John's favorite. He was the chief portrait photographer at RKO. He was there for a long time, not quite as long as Clarence Bull, but he had a 30-year career. On the right, from about 1934, Katherine Hepburn. And we don't have very many images in the 50s, great images. The Foundation's collection is strong from the late teens, 20s, 30s, 40s, and not so much in the 1950s. So it's nice to be able to show this, I think, remarkable photograph from 1952 of Marilyn Monroe. There's plenty to be discovered in the Foundation's collection. So visit the hood, find your favorites, photographers, stars, and thank you.
Thank you, Bob. So Mary's now up.
Okay, good afternoon. I want to thank the Hood for inviting me, and I'm very honored to be on this panel with Simon and Bob. I'm going to talk a little bit today about how we can think about the photos in the collection in relation to film history and to what their teaching purposes might be or their research purposes might be. So I'm going to argue here, and though I may not use these words again, they're implicit in everything I say, that these photos are historical documents, they're evidence. We can think of Kobal as a historiograph, not only a historian, but historiographer, because he implied why certain things in history matter. He had a theory of history. He lived it, and in his collection, what he collected and what he emphasized in that collection. Not only did he suggest what mattered, but who gets to tell history. And one of the things that's wonderful about his work is that he allows photographers and their subjects to tell history. And then I'm going to suggest some ways that I, as a historian and as a teacher, might use this collection and might have my students use it. And I'm going to focus on Rita Hayworth, which Simon mentioned, was Kobal's favorite star. So let's see. See, I'm having a hard time advancing now. I'm using my advance key and it's not working. It was during the demonstration we did.
Have you requested control?
Also, it might be, Mary, sometimes you have to go to that little icon at the bottom where it says end, and then you manually advance it each time rather than using the arrows.
I don't see that icon. Let's see. In fact, it won't even let me stop sharing. Let's see.
And everybody who's online, please pardon this delay.
Yeah,
this is one of the problems.
Maybe I should try to start again.
Okay.
If you go to view up, okay.
Let's see.
We'll be right back. We're gonna ride the course.
Okay, let's see.
You have to.
Okay, there we go. It was just a matter of rebooting a little bit. Okay. I'm going to start off by talking a little bit about how important these photos are for thinking about the history of Hollywood. And one of the things that I think is important to remember, that Hollywood's film production was a key American industry in this studio era period of the mid 1920s to the 1960s, not only because of the economic success of its main product, which were motion pictures, but also because the extensive reach of its cultural influence. And this extensive reach of cultural influence was made possible partly through the circulation of photographic portraits and film stills to print media at a global scale. While still photography was employed in the studios for their own internal needs, so they needed to document sets and props and costumes during the process of film production, the studios required a prodigious output of photos from their staff photographers because they had certain promotional and publicity needs. And actually Bob talks about the sheer number of photos and negatives that they took at all the studios in his book about Ruth, Harriet, Louise, which I highly recommend. These photos included photographic stills, which were photos of key moments in film narratives, and these were used for theater lobby cards. I'm sure there's some people in the audience that are old enough to remember the largish, maybe 8x11 cards that had that were posted on the walls of theaters that would have some kind of key moment of the narrative that would be captured in a photo on these lobby cards. They were used for those. They were used for film posters, and also for advertising copy that print magazines and newspapers could use to advertise the films. The portraits of the stars would be distributed to fan magazines and to what was in the 20th century a rapidly proliferating set of pictorial magazines, the most famous of which were magazines like Life and Look. From these magazines, a star portrait could end up on the wall of a teenage girl's bedroom bedroom or of a GI's army barrack. So the portraits might be first circulated through a magazine, but their use didn't end there. Their use then was incorporated into the kind of quotidian life of the user, the reader, and maybe their fantasy life as well. When the studios collapsed or were absorbed into conglomeration in the 1960s, they disposed of, and sometimes literally trashed, threw in the trash can, their voluminous inventory of photos and negatives. And John Kobal recognized what could be made of this transitional moment, this remnants of the industry's cultural and economic transitions. And I want to emphasize that I think one of the things that's important about his collection and the moment in which he was first starting to collect, that his particular project and his writings about these photos, they avoided the stark binary that was promulgated by his journalistic peers. So his peer group of journalists tended at this time in the 1960s and 70s to either treat old Hollywood very cynically or with some kind of reverent nostalgia. And I think Kobal's collection and the history that they imply actually avoids that kind of stark binary. It doesn't have to be one or the other. Kobal, on the other hand, took the images seriously as art objects, as historical documents, and representative of a past culture's fantasies about beauty, identity, and power. So what do we do with these images now? Since I don't have a lot of time, I'm going to take my few minutes remaining to suggest some ways, from my perspective as a historian, how the collection could generate a variety of historical or critical analyses of mass-produced photographic images. And I will focus my suggestions around a limited number of portraits and film stills of Rita Hayworth. In his book, The Art of the Great Hollywood Portrait Photographers, Kobal favorably compares Hollywood photographic portraits to paintings. And in these images of Rita Hayworth that we have right here, one could look for what one might look for in analyzing a portrait by John Singer Sargent or Vermeer. In other words, the use of light and shadow, things that Bob just talked about in relation to those beautiful Joan Crawford portraits. So use of light and shadow, dress, pose, expression, and the relation between figure and background or surroundings. From this kind of analysis that, as I say, has a relationship to what we might do if we were an art historian in relation to a painted portrait, we might be led in this analysis to make conjectures about the concept of social identity and individual subjectivity in the era from which these photos came. So that's one possible avenue of critical analysis that I could use in teaching and that my students could do that kind of formal analysis, and we could think about the era in which these photos were made and what do the particular compositions say about how people in the 1930s and 40s thought about social identity, how they thought about individual subjectivity. For the historian who is interested in the development of a star persona, and a star persona is an amalgam of the fictional characters that a performer plays with the personality and image that's constructed for her through publicity, including these publicity photos. So the publicity photo can reveal the process of industrial manufacture of celebrity, as well as cultural and social values about gender, sexuality, race and ethnicity, and power. So in these images here, the photo of Rita Hayworth having some kind of skiing accident in what was surely a studio concocted situation to take the photo. This was a very sort of typical kind of pose when a performer was being first groomed by the studios. When they would come under contract, most performers had to go through, unless they were famous from another medium like the stage or recording or something, they had to go through a series of trainings of elocution, dancing lessons, how to walk, how to wear clothes. And they often would be put in publicity photos that were not meant to publicize any particular film, but instead to publicize this rising star, what we might today call a starlet. So we have this very sort of innocent, but very typical pose for Rita Hayworth. There's nothing particularly special about it. It doesn't necessarily convey great charisma. Now we have on the other image by Robert Coburn is a publicity portrait that was taken for the film Gilda, which I'm going to focus a lot of my images on Gilda, 1946 film, often considered to be a film noir. And in this, she's actually in costume that her character would wear in Gilda. Though the publicity portrait here abstracts her away from any kind of identifiable sets. So one of the things we might ask if we were a historian of stardom and wanted to trace the development of a star persona is how do we get from that innocent starlet and that look that was concocted for her and all the values that are associated with that to this other image in which you have a very sophisticated and powerful woman. So that's something that a historian of star personas might consider. And both of these images are from the collection. If we were to add another image that I don't believe is from the collection, and maybe Simon or Bob can correct me, but this image of Rita Hayworth on my screen left here, when she was known as Rita Cancino, this was right at the moment when she was transitioning from her work as a dancer. She was partnered with her father, and they were on the vaudeville circuit and as well as the nightclub circuit doing dances, mainly Spanish-themed dances. So if we were to add this other photo, we would have to think about all of these stages that Rita Cancino took to become Rita Hayworth, or what the studio pressured her into becoming the Rita Hayworth on the far right image. And there have been some historians of Rita Hayworth's image that have talked about how elements of her Latin ethnicity were erased in this transition from Rita Cancino to the Rita Hayworth of Gilda. It was something that the studios didn't exactly hide because they took publicity photos of this transition. But it was something that has, it's something that has social implications in terms of how this industrial manufacture of Hollywood stars often erases certain marks of identity that in many cases speaks to how certain, in this case, ethnic origins are marginalized in that culture. So studying this history of the development of star persona can take us not only into the process of industrial manufacture, but it also can lead us to ask certain questions about race, ethnicity, and gender, and sexuality. Okay, another way that for historians, these images can be very illustrative is to think about their circulation. So I'm going to show you a few pages from what was called a press book, a studio press book for a film. Every film would have a press book that was made by the studios in which there would be advertising copy, reprints of those portraits that were taken in those portrait settings. And what you see here, some of these images are from portraits that are in the collection. And they would be suggestions to local exhibitors and to entertainment editors at newspapers for what they could use to promote the film to their constituents. Okay, so they were basically suggestions and the offer of advertising copy. One of the things that I found interesting about the Gilda Press book is that there's a whole page devoted to what they call a gallery of Hayworth art. So they're actually showcasing these studio photographers. I don't believe they credit them on this page, but they're showcasing some of the work of the portrait sessions that they did with most likely Robert Coburn did with Rita Hayworth in preparation to create a publicity campaign for Gilda. And one of the things that I found interesting about this particular page is that the studio, one of the angles is that they are trying to convince newspaper editors that these represent cheesecake photography, which is usually slightly more salacious than the kind of photography, the glamour photography that Bob was talking about. But they're positioning these photos in a tradition of the cheesecake sexual objectification kind of photography that would be in men's magazines. And they're suggesting that this is these Gilda photos are what's going to sell their newspapers. So here's a close-up of some of these images, and you'll recognize the one on the left from that Coburn photo that Simon showed in his PowerPoint and that I'm showing as well. So these images could be used in posters, and these press books had global reach. They prepared these for domestic print media and exhibitors, as well as their foreign markets. And you see here how that particular photographic image gets repurposed for poster art. And these are French and Spanish posters. The Spanish-speaking markets were very important to Hollywood at this time in the 1940s, not only for a growing domestic population of Spanish language citizens in the US, but also for the Spanish language market. Gilda was made or was released in 1946. During the 1940s, the government had a good neighbor policy with Latin America. And a part of that, of course, was about having Latin America as an ally during the war years. So Spanish-speaking markets had become very important to the studios. And one of the things with Gilda, it's also set in Buenos Aires, the story is. And so you can find an abundance of these images embedded in Spanish language promotional and publicity copy. You can actually Google a lot of these. So these are from for Spanish-speaking markets. They're these postcards in Spanish, and you can see that they take again from the photographic images. They've repurposed these, and the portrait could also part of the portrait could also be used for advertising. This is for Max Factor pancake makeup. It's a Spanish language advertisement, but I'm sure that there's an English version of this because a Max Factor had ad copy in hundreds of print magazines during this era in the United States. But you can see how, again, part of the photographic portrait gets inserted into ad copy. Now I just have a few remaining images here, and I found these interesting because we can see that in many cases, the studios would have the studio photographers do portraits with their major stars who had a film coming out, especially for the female stars, that they would have photos in which the star was depicted in many of the film's costumes. So we saw that incredible strapless satin gown. There's both a black satin gown, and then there's another one that was featured in different colors depending on the advertising context. This is another famous costume that Hayworth wore in Gilda. And we have some images here that I know for sure are from the Kobal collection. And then we have a film still on the far right where we have Hayworth in motion when she's actually wearing the costume for a dance number that she does in the film. But you can see how doing these photo sessions with the stars allowed the photographers, the star, and the studio to try out sort of different personalities and moods that the performer could affect in these costumes. So we have, some of these images mimic that kind of femme fatale, sultry, transgressive femininity pose that we saw on the satin gown. But then we have the one, for instance, on the top left, in which we have a much more kind of wholesome image of Hayworth, where she looks like very pretty, but an ordinary woman who's smiling for the camera. And then of course the film still provides this possibility of looking at her in motion or imagining her in motion, in which what the viewer would see when they went to the film. And we can see that these images are picked up, this more sort of wholesome normative femininity that is conveyed through that set of portraits is picked up in a different kind of advertising. So instead of the Max Factor pancake makeup, in which women are being led to believe that they too can be a femme fatale through the lipstick and the powder, we have this more sort of normative femininity image with the Lux soap. They're trying to promote a much more wholesome kind of image. And then we have on the right, we have the cover of a fan magazine. Fan magazines were very heavily promoted for a teenage female audience or a young female adult audience. So they were not producing, for the most part, the portraits that could be used in these cheesecake kind of fashion, or that would end up as a pinup in an army barrack. So we can see that the portrait photography, there were strategies in terms of thinking about how could these portraits have differentiation in particular ways that could serve a variety of different audiences, and in all cases promote the star and promote the film. Okay, and then I just have these last images here. These are how these images still circulate today, which I'm very interested as a historian. And when I teach classes, I have students often look at contemporary social media, blogs, Facebook pages of stars, and see, to what extent do contemporary users, those that are authors of social media sites, what do they see in these images? What are they picking up from them? Are they picking up the wholesome normative femininity, or the more transgressive femme fatale version of femininity that these photographic sessions and these images allow us to think about that kind of range? And then here's actually, Gilda and Rita Hayworth have multiple Facebook pages, should you want to know, followed by thousands of people. And then there's a website too that I took an image here from, where a woman is just focused on the costumes that Rita Hayworth is wearing in Gilda. And you can finally see in that image that she took from the film, or took from a film still, that you can actually see the satin gown in motion, or what it was in the film, because it actually appears very briefly in the film, but it of course is central to the iconicity of the portrait with the cigarette smoke. Okay, I think that's it for me.
Thank you so much, Mary. And I wanted to also say that you're going to be teaching a course at Dartmouth on fashion and Hollywood photography, using the Kobal Foundation collection that's now at the Hood. We're about at time. It's exactly 1:30. But why don't we just do one question before we sign off? And Sharon, I believe that there is one question. Right?
Yes, we do. We do have one question, and this is actually directed, a question for John. We have people are wondering how this photography collection came to be in the Hood Museum of Art.
Robert Dance. I have to say that when I first arrived at Dartmouth, Robert was in conversations with Kathy Hart about the possibility that the Kobal collection would become available. And we demonstrated our enthusiasm. I remember a cup of coffee in New York with Bob, or lunch in New York with Bob. And then pretty soon we were all in London together in some storage area going through photographs, and the rest is history. So thank you, a huge thank you to a terrific alum of Dartmouth College who brought this opportunity to us. It's an amazing gift. And thank you to Simon and the foundation for making this possible.
I was going to add one thing, actually.
Please.
Yeah, which is that, I mean, from our perspective, what was important, because John had spent decades putting this archive together, and there are always people circling around interested in it, but for commercial reasons. But we wanted it to go somewhere. What was very important was that it went somewhere that people would have access to it, and access for study and access for perpetuating, you know, the work. And so it was a marriage of that desire and Robert's canniness in finding the right place for it to go. And so we're extremely happy to have it at the Hood, and look forward to an ongoing relationship, you know.
Yeah, I just to add to that a little bit, you know, that was the how, but the why is much more interesting. Why would this collection come to Dartmouth? And it's because of the life we will give it, as has been demonstrated here today. I mean, you know, you introduced us to John Kobal and his history. Robert Dance introduced us to some of the photographers who are largely unsung heroes in the history of 20th century photography, despite the massive contribution they made. I mean, just think of how many more people saw their photographs than the average like New York art photographer or something like that. I mean, this is of huge importance. And then you can see the work that Mary is beginning to do on kind of this traffic in photographic imagery and how these images lived. And, you know, she was talking about how, yes, it might appear in One Life magazine, but that One Life magazine would get shared around the neighborhood, cut up, put up in the barn, put up in the house. I mean, the role of these images permeating culture, we really can't study the United States and many other places as well in the 20th century without this material. And to us, it's just the dawn of a new day in how we understand visual culture and culture in general in the United States.
And also it's a tribute to the legacy of the Film and Media Studies department here at Dartmouth as well. Bob often talking, as he did today, about that legacy, which is a very important one at Dartmouth. So I guess that finishes our
Thank you all
today. Yeah.
That was wonderful. And for our audience, know we will be doing this again. You can hear all three of these people have many more things to say about this fascinating archive. We'll be back. Probably next year when the museum is open and we start doing exhibitions of the actual material. Look for that to start up in 2022. All right. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you. All right.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye. Bye.